All right, that's a great spot for us to kick off introduction. So my name is John Yonke. I'm CEO of Tackle. Excited to be here and really excited to be joined by a few amazing panelists as we talk about how you can brace for budget tightening with cloud marketplaces. And just quick agenda-wise before we do intros, I'll do a bit of a preamble on what we're seeing in the market from Tackle's perspective. And then we'll dive into a chat about the current economic climate and changes we're seeing impact buying and selling cycles. And then from there, we'll shift gears into talking a bit about cloud and marketplaces. And we've designed this to be really an interactive discussion. So please feel free to put questions in the chat, ask questions in Q&A. I'm going to be the MC for the discussion, so I will do my best to weave those into the conversation as we go. And let's get after it. So why don't we start with Mike Asher. Mike, if you could introduce yourself, we can jump in from there and you can hand it off to Ben or Dave.
Okay, no problem. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike. I am the CFO, again, part of the fun crowd of a company called Neo4j, a pretty cool database company, which is based in Sweden, but I'm here in the Bay Area. My experience is mostly with, it's with technology companies. I've been a CFO for a lot of companies for a while. So I've seen a bunch of boom times and kind of downturns in the economy. So this is just the latest one, but each one has a different wrinkle. Ironically, I actually started my career as a software developer, but then kind of switched over midstream to be a CFO. And I've been in finance for very large public companies to very small startups. I also happen to be on the board of Tackle, which is how I know the team here. So really nice to be here and look forward to a good discussion. Why don't I hand it over to Dave next?
Great. Hey, everybody. I'm David Schneider. I'm actually an investor in Tackle and from a firm called Cotu. But prior to joining Cotu, I spent my career, about 30 years, running go-to-market revenue teams, most recently 10 years at ServiceNow, where I led all the go-to-market teams from $100 million to about $5 billion. And prior to that, Data Domain, another data storage company, from $0 through IPO and eventually about $1 billion in revenue when we sold the company. So I'm excited to be here talking about all things marketplaces and all things revenue.
And I'll take it from there. So I'm Ben. I'm the CFO of Tackle. My entire career I spent in tech. I joined Tackle about 8 months ago. Prior to that, I was a CFO at Klaviyo, which is a marketing and customer data company based out of Boston. And then prior to that, I spent the last decade or so at Qualtrics, helping it grow from about 20 million in revenue when I joined to about $1 billion when I left. So seen all sorts of interesting challenges and opportunities through all that.
Awesome. Yeah, and I mean, maybe just a few words. Mike's been with us for a long time, really since we got started with Tackle, but I think brings really unique perspective, both as a big consumer of cloud, as a company that marketplaces, and a later stage growth company. So I think that's one perspective we have on this call. Ben, being CFO of Tackle, like a startup, moving into the growth phase of our journey and really scaling. And obviously, marketplace is our business. We help hundreds of software companies sell through the marketplace, but we also leverage marketplace extensively internally in our buying process. So I think interesting perspective there. And then lastly, Dave Schneider brings the revenue, I think a combination of the revenue executive and the CEO persona to this call, and has partnered with CFOs, has sold to CFOs, and I think just is a really unique complement. So thanks guys for being here, really excited. So, just from an intro standpoint, the current climate, like every software company is looking for any way to win business that they can. But selling has definitely gotten more difficult over the last year or two. And according to Forrester, 75% of buyers say their average buying cycle has increased in length over the last 24 months. And a bit counterintuitive with all the talk of product-led growth and usage-based pricing that you see in the industry. And, we've seen buying committees expand and enterprise purchase cycles are taking longer than ever, with procurement processes becoming more rigid. Buyers are tightening up budgets and companies are more focused than ever on their bottom line. And efficiency is really key for all companies, both for buyers and for sellers. And budgets are getting harder to find, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And your ability to find and attach to new relevant budgets as a seller are really critical. And this is where enter the clouds. So IDC estimates full year cloud spending this year in 22 will grow 22%. And that means we're going to add approximately $90 billion to the cloud budget, making it top out around a whopping $490 billion. And Cloud Marketplace enabled both buyers and sellers to take advantage of this rapidly growing budget. And those who can take advantage of this movement are winning. And just a few examples. So Mike Scarpelli, who's the CFO of Snowflake, in Q4 talked on their earnings call about how 700 million of their $1.2 billion in bookings were generated by co-selling with the cloud providers. So a pretty amazing statistic. George Kurtz, who's the CEO of CrowdStrike, talked about how they were able to cut their sales cycles down by nearly 50% when they were leveraging AWS Marketplace. And then, Seek, who's a Tackle customer, is a cloud IoT platform for manufacturing. And they saw their marketplace revenue grow from 0 to 20% of bookings over 2 years. And I think that's a particularly interesting case since it's a vertical solution, not traditionally sold to the cloud buyer. And lastly, Satya this year from Microsoft at Microsoft Inspire talked about how they've done nearly $32 billion of cloud co-sell since they initiated their program in 2018. When we started Tackle, we believe the clouds had changed the way that so much of technology had operated, but had yet to change the way that software was bought and sold, and marketplaces represented the initiation of enterprise sales moving from offline to online. And we're in the earliest days of this offline to online transformation of B2B software sales, but we're really seeing things start to accelerate. And we believe over the next 5 years, you'll continue to see cloud budgets and enterprise software budgets. The lines between them will start to blur. And that will turn into like this $1 trillion super budget between cloud and enterprise software budgets. And, just personally, as a lifelong B2B seller, pre-sales person, customer success person, it's been really fun to be part of this evolution over the last 5 years. And I'm excited to dive deeper into how we can help everyone navigate through these economic times of marketplace. So maybe first and foremost, why don't we start with, how are you seeing the current economic landscape impact buying and selling processes? I mean, Mike, I'd love maybe to start with you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned and John mentioned, so I'm the CFO of Neo4j, and so what's interesting for me is I'm seeing both sides of the equation here. So I'm a CFO. We're buying lots of software. Lots of people are selling to us. So, and I'm looking at budgets. I'm looking at the economy. I'm looking at our forecasts and things like that, and helping make sure that we're prioritizing what we buy. I also work closely with our sales team, who is now starting to leverage the cloud providers as well and the marketplace. And so at a high level, and I would say this is no surprise, just with the macroeconomic climate, inflation rates, there's wars going on in Europe, there's just lots of uncertainty, which makes everyone more hesitant, including me at Neo4j. So when I look at the spend, we're still spending on important initiatives, but we're trying to say, all right, what's the must-have? What do we need to spend now? What can we push off? Let's be judicious with this. So that's on the spend side. So we're doing that. On the selling side, we're still getting deals done. There's still a lot of demand for our product, but we are seeing, especially on some of the bigger ticket items, deals take a little bit longer, more scrutiny, more where there's yet another level of signatures. And what's interesting in times like this, people, and I see our sales team kind of go to their strengths. And what we're seeing in some of the strong areas is when we leverage partners, and that could come in the form of SIs, but it could also come in the form of more modern cloud partners. And so we're seeing the more progressive salespeople that we have really leverage the marketplace during times like this to accelerate some of their deals, or to make them more certain that they'll get through, that they won't get cut because they're part of an important, bigger project that's leveraging some of these partners. So we're seeing all of that, and happy to delve in more as we have more of the question.
Yeah, that's cool. And I mean, maybe Schneider, if you want to comment Dave.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on to what Mike was saying, because I've sold to personalities and personas ranging from the CIO to the CFO to lines of business, et cetera. And unfortunately for me, I'm old enough to have gone through a few cycles, and this one is a slightly different cycle than prior cycles that sort of happened all at once. There was a seminal event with Lehman Brothers closing, or the dot-com crash, and those things were like, the world just got really constrained really quickly. I think we're surfing a wave into a recession at this point, where different parts of the market are slowing things down, but almost everybody's going through another layer of inspection in the sales process. And whenever you're a go-to-market person or a go-to-market executive, you have to think about, what are the questions that I could ask that will help me understand where this fits in the priority, and how does somebody want to buy, right? And so if you're not asking those questions in a good cycle or a bad cycle, that's an opportunity for you and your sales team to think about, where does this project stand against the other priorities? Who's driving it? What happens if they don't do it? And what's the best way for them to acquire it, where they can use up budget dollars through partners or through other mechanisms that make the most sense? And I think that's really the crux of this conversation, John, is this notion of the cloud marketplace may be a speed ramp to a deal. And it doesn't guarantee you a deal, but it gives you an opportunity to find money and sources of money that may already be contractually obligated, that you need to tap into.
Great. And Ben, I'd be curious to hear from you on, like, obviously Tackle's a earlier stage growth company. Like, how is our buying? We buy a lot of software, we consume a lot of tools, we're a fully remote and distributed company, always looking for ways to automate and innovate. But how's our buying process changed?
Yeah, so it has changed pretty radically over the past year or so. And ultimately, as we've continued to evolve as a company, we've gone from more of the startup phase to more of the growth phase. And it's been a lot of change from focus on speed to focus on scalability. And, you combine that with how markets have shifted over the past year and how multiples have become compressed. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of other CFOs in similar situations to Tackle, where, there are a lot of conversations about, how do we focus more on profitability? How do we get away from the grow at all cost mindset? And I think Tackle, we have done a pretty good job at that over the past, 6 months or so. And we've been really focusing more on asking our vendors more questions, going through more diligence. And frankly, the biggest change, I think, is twofold. One, we're going through a much more robust vendor selection process every time we choose a vendor, where vendors will come to us and we'll actually have 3 or 4 people going through a full process. And when you go through that, little things can be the tipping point between going with one vendor versus another. And the other is just vendor consolidation. And as we think about our overall tech stack, making sure that every technology we utilize has value for us and there's not duplication of vendors, et cetera, throughout. And I think that it's pretty common across, especially across tech, to see other functions going through that same increased level of rigor overall.
Do I have any comments about that?
Fairly logical.
I would expect nothing less from our CFO friends.
Yeah, I think at Neo4j, I mean, one of the things that we're doing, so I think Ben said something that resonates of in 2021, like money was just pouring into companies like tech companies and really the stock market's at a high. It was really kind of grow at all costs and invest for the future. So when we were buying software, it was really on an eye on, okay, now we need to buy kind of ahead of the curve here because we're growing really fast for year 2 and year 3. One of the things that we look at now is like, okay, what do we need right now? Can we get in smaller, prove it, and then grow it over time? So that's another way that we're looking at it. And conversely, we're seeing that in some of our sales cycles too, where is there a way, instead, maybe the big deal that we were going after may or may not be there, but is there a plan B where we can get in quicker, maybe smaller, bite size, but then prove it and grow it fairly rapidly? So we're seeing that on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that point as we talk more about cloud marketplace. And just, I mean, curious to hear your thoughts just on cloud from a consumption standpoint, growing through these times, staying the same, strategic, and maybe even how marketplace fits into that for you as a consumer.
Me?
Yeah, you, Mike.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so through all of this is what everyone probably knows on this call, kind of the cloud transformation. So this, it's not like that this was 100% and then the economy hits a speed bump and it goes from 100 to 0. Every company is still going through this, still moving their workloads to the cloud. I'm hearing every day that like big conservative financial institutions, for example, are moving more of their workload to the cloud. So this is not slowing down at all. And the economy, yes, it's giving people pause on kind of what do they buy right now versus later. But the mega trend is clear and it's there. There's the cloud transformation is happening. And then also from a partnership standpoint, like the big SIs and the regional SIs and things like that. But the cloud providers, it's a massive business and is growing really fast. And that train has left the station. So while we see kind of changes from last year to this year in terms of some of the details, the overall trend, no doubt, is still intact and moving in that direction. So even if we're not getting there as quickly from a Neo4j perspective as maybe we thought a few quarters ago, it's still a huge part of what we discussed and where we're investing and where we're headed.
Hey, Mike, question on that for you, actually. So within Tackle, what we've started to do is bucket our types of spend into like critical, can't do without this spend versus, nice to have versus sort of luxury spend at the bottom there. And then, applying the resources, commensurate with those different buckets. When you talk about, cloud providers and spending with those cloud providers, for us, we bucketed that into like the critical, have to spend this money because it's going to keep the lights on for us as a business. When you think about, how the markets have changed, are you still spending as much with cloud providers now as you were historically? Or like, how do you think about that transformation with the spend with cloud providers?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. And so maybe there's two competing factors here. One is kind of the mega trend that we were talking about, where every year it's more and more in the cloud. And then I guess the headwinds there are the economy and what you were saying earlier, growth versus efficiency, that kind of calculation. And so what I would say is that even though 2022 with the economy, there is more caution and I guess maybe I'll say thoughtfulness going into the different purchases, we're still going to invest a whole lot more with the cloud providers this year than last year, regardless of that. So that's why my feeling, at least, is the overall trend is eclipsing the macroeconomic headwinds. It doesn't mean the macroeconomic headwinds aren't there. And like you said, kind of looking at must-have spend versus nice-to-have is certainly something that we're doing. But overall, our spend is significantly higher with the cloud providers and the marketplace this year than last year, even with all these factors.
Dave, to that point, I'd be curious to hear more from a revenue executive standpoint, how like that cloud movement, you're seeing that play out either across your portfolio or peers in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the days of somebody building an internal data center are friggin' gone. Like, you don't ever go into a CIO's office or a CFO's office and look at the line item for, a $400 million brand new data center. Like, I just haven't heard that happening very often in all of my enterprise contacts right now. So in general, the spend and real estate spend, everything else is moving to a cloud provider or a hosting provider, et cetera. In the movement of everything outside your real estate is going to be there. I think to the extent that other folks were talking about buckets of spend, you have to associate yourself with a mission critical activity. That's your job as a software technology provider, builder of things. It really is important for you to link to something that's important. If you're in the nice to have / luxury spend item list going into a downturn, you got to figure out how to convert your current positioning to something else to be successful. The cloud providers, they're going to grow at the rate of the market, and they're going to go, maybe not 23%, 22% on a huge number is massive. And, I do think the trend line shift in that way.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the theme around clouds, the cloud providers are rapidly accelerating budget consolidation in enterprises. Mike, I think when we talked earlier in the week, you're like, hey, outside of people, this ends up being one of the largest costs in growth companies. And
correct me if I'm wrong, for someone like Mike, when AWS or Google or Azure is coming to him and saying, hey, for your internal use and for your customer use, et cetera, we want you to commit to, $50 million worth of spend. Now Mike's got a committed number that is related to the consumption that he needs to run his business, but there's also just a committed number. And the cool thing for all the people on the line who are thinking about using marketplaces to sell is that committed number is really, really important to go access and figure out, how do I unlock some of those dollars from people like Mike? That's really the key here.
Yeah, Mike, anything you want to say to that point? I think that's a powerful point. We see like one of the top, we do the State of the Cloud Marketplace survey every year, and one of the top reasons why sellers want a marketplace is the ability to tap into committed spend. And I mean, from a buyer CFO standpoint, is that something you actively think about as a hedge to your cloud commitment, or an ability to make even a bigger commitment?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because this committed spend, it encompasses multiple things for at least for me and Neo4j. One would be, what are we spending directly in cloud consumption? But it also gives us the ability to buy software from ISVs as part of this committed spend. So in some ways, by committing the spend, I'm pre-committing, but getting a discount for it. And so therefore, if I end up buying software from a software vendor that is not the cloud provider, I, in some ways, am getting an additional discount because it's going to impact my overall spend. So then when someone comes to me and says, hey, we want to buy this piece of software for $100,000 or $200,000 or whatever it is, in some ways it's actually discounted from there because I'm getting a discount just through another mechanism. But also if someone comes to me and says, hey, we want to buy 200K and it's not going to count against our committed spend, or someone comes to me and says, we want to buy this 200K piece of software and it is part of the committed spend. It's exactly what Dave and Ben were talking about, where, hey, it still has to meet the bar of, is this really important and must have and going to move the needle for the company? But right below that is, hey, we've already committed this spend, whether the macroeconomic is slowing down or not, that is all systems go and we're getting the discount. It just makes it that much easier as opposed to finding another bucket of budget that we have to go find.
Yeah, Mike, I don't think it's as, the parallel I look at is, if I'm going to get cash back on a credit card for buying something, I'm going to use that credit card versus the non-cash back mechanism, right? So it's just a buying preference to go do that. And, you know, I think most of us have experience in our personal lives where we've now got affinity cards based on some kind of discount or quote unquote value. We basically have an affinity card with our Google or Microsoft or Amazon relationships where we're getting value beyond just this transaction. And we're kind of thinking about ways to unlock that value.
Yeah, I love that credit card analogy. I think it's a really simple way to think about the power of these marketplace budgets.
I'm a simple man, John, simple.
That's one other phenomenon we've seen, and this is an unscripted question, but the cloud budgets have changed where, 3 years ago, cloud budgets were often owned by either, a director of operations or a head of engineering. And as they've grown and become more strategic and larger in scale, they have transitioned to finance and procurement ownership. I'd be curious, Mike, was the ultimate cloud budget always owned by finance, or did your company go through that evolution over the last handful of years?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is different than what I've seen in my career. It is a change where, for example, we have a SaaS product and we run in the cloud. So the cloud, that particular portion of our cloud spend budget would have been owned by our engineering group, right? Because it's essentially a cost of our going to SaaS go to market. But now the cloud budget, I guess two things. One, it's gotten broader, where it's impacting multiple areas of the company. And it's also gotten much, much bigger. So like you said, for a software company like Neo4j, there's hey, people by far is our biggest investment area. But our cloud spend and these cloud commits are there a clear number two, even bigger than like facilities and like all this other stuff. And so therefore it's become not only multi-departmental, but much bigger, to where companies like ours are actually hiring people to manage this because it's so big. And if we can just make it, 10 times more efficient or negotiate it a little better, the impact is so large. So it's getting a lot of attention up to C-level executives. And therefore, if the market's going that way, the trend is going that way, the spend is already committed there, it's just removing friction. It's not a magic wand where it's gonna, you just say, hey, we're part of the cloud, and all of a sudden deals are gonna show up on your doorstep. But if you can remove friction in any meaningful way in this type of environment, that's where you wanna be. And so it's getting a lot of attention in a way that I haven't seen with other partners like SIs and other things. It's taking more of the budget and it's more expansive.
And I think we'll kind of circle back to key takeaways at the end, but I do think the durability of the cloud budget, the strategic relevance of the cloud budget, and how, cloud and enterprise software budget, those lines are starting to blur. I think that's one of the key takeaways for this. And
that's right. And it's multi-year. We're not just committing to 2022. We're committing to like a 3-year cycle.
Yeah. So there was actually a question in chat related to committed number. If you have a committed number and already have a path to achieve it, is it still motivating to make a purchase using these funds for a software purchase?
I think the CFOs are probably better to answer that than I am. I have a belief in that, but I don't know, maybe Ben, what do you think?
So my perspective on that is yes, and the primary reason is simply when you go through there, you actually have the ability to renegotiate your committed spend with the providers. And so if you can build a specific run rate where you're exceeding your committed spend, then you can go back to any of these cloud providers and renegotiate that and get a larger committed spend overall. So I mean, so when I was at Klaviyo, we actually had a committed spend of tens of millions of dollars with one of the cloud providers. And you know, it was very similar to that, where it's like, yes, we felt like we had a strong path to getting there, but we still wanted to push all of our spending there. You know, in every instance where it made sense that we could, I mean, if you can save 1 or 2% off of $40 million by renegotiating, you want to do that every time.
What do you think of the argument, Ben, though, of reducing paperwork and putting a new vendor in your system and all of that? Like, one of the challenges when we were at ServiceNow is the thousands of vendors that we were having to manage, which included doing diligence on the various vendor risk and having direct party relationship versus third party relationship. One is a vendor for you as a software company. If you go through Amazon or one of the other players, you kind of know you're going to get paid at the end of the day. You could argue about when you're going to get paid, but you're going to get paid. Whereas you've got risk selling through to a SMB or some other company about getting paid potentially. Plus you got the contract process you've got to go through, the vendor risk assessment. What's your take on the consumption side of that? You know, when your team's like, oh, just another vendor we got to sign up. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, and there's two sides of this. I mean, I think from our perspective, from a Tackle perspective, there's if we are buying through the marketplace, there are definitely benefits from the ability to get onto some standard contract terms, which, you know, can at times greatly accelerate our legal processing, which is good for the sellers, but is also really good for us to not have to spend as many resources on legal or continually be following up with, you know, sometimes what can be a weeks-long process going back and forth on contracting. As well as from an accounts payable standpoint, like we actually have a large portion of our vendors flowing through marketplaces today, which dramatically reduces the amount of hours that need to be spent on, you know, understanding how do we bill for XYZ thing. And then on the flip side, when we do sell a decent amount via marketplaces, and it's really helpful on the collection side to know that the collections are going to come. And so we don't have to have as many AR resources. We can feel much more confident in the ability to get those collections in because they are going through a cloud provider.
Thanks, Ben.
We had another question, and I'll pose this. I'm not sure I may end up being the one to answer it, but wondering if folks are seeing teams within their companies taking advantage of pay-as-you-go listings on marketplace, given the capital shortage. We just heard from our VP of product management that he wants to deprecate pay-as-you-go to focus only on private offers.
I don't know if I have enough information to answer that question. You probably see it in your base more than
yeah. I would say, like, where maybe I'll take a whack at this from a Tackle standpoint, and then maybe we could pivot the question to talk a bit about pay-as-you-go versus contract and how you think about that in finance. But from a marketplace standpoint, the majority of dollars today flowing through the marketplaces are related to private offers. People who are accelerating transactions, tapping into the cloud budget, leveraging the cloud contract to do, you know, first deals faster and bigger, repeat deals bigger. And we do expect that experience to evolve over time. And you end up in the classic "it depends" answer around pay-as-you-go versus private offers, because it does depend a lot on your product and the way it's consumed. But people don't necessarily shop on marketplace today. If you think about where your products are discovered, a lot of times people will Google a problem, will find their way to some content that leads to potentially your website, and then they read some case studies or read about your product and end up initiating some sort of conversation there. Marketplace today are much more about fulfillment and execution, but we do think that's going to change over time. And I like to look at the consumer landscape. Like in 2000, you bought books from Amazon. You never would have thought about buying a TV. In 2005, you didn't think twice about buying a TV. I think the shopping behavior is going to change significantly. And as people become more accustomed to using marketplaces to go faster and have these consolidated spends, then I think shopping experiences do start to evolve. So happy to, like, that's one we could definitely chat about offline. Feel free, like, ping me or anyone from Tackle, and we could help you navigate some thoughts there. Mike, Ben, just from a finance standpoint, like when someone wants to start something new and there's options for pay-as-you-go versus contract, like how do you steer those discussions?
At least from my perspective, so we are doing mostly the contracts and the private offers. There's maybe some pay-as-you-go, and I'm not sure exactly if pay-as-you-go, is that referring to you don't need the contract, you just get started, you go, or is it where the lead is coming from? It seems like maybe there's
pay-as-you-go, like the nuance pay-as-you-go would be like starting with a free trial or a usage-based model where you're getting billed for, gigabytes of consumption or something.
Okay.
Usage-based metrics.
Yeah, so I can describe what we're doing and you can tell me what bucket it fits in. But we are doing what I would call a hybrid, which is we have private offers with contracts for a consumption-based usage model. So someone would sign up for a year, for example, with a minimum commit, but then it ultimately is based on consumption of the gigabytes and all that stuff. So it's kind of a hybrid, maybe in this world. And we're finding that this is actually really a really good fit for the marketplace, where the ability to get started quickly, get going with a consumption-based model makes the sales cycle and the proof of concept go much faster, because they're not necessarily committing to some giant multi-year thing. It's get going quickly, show the value, and grow it over time. And the fact that the procurement cycle can be quicker, and in fact, in advance of being on this webinar, I was talking to some of our sales folks who are using the marketplace. And what they were describing was some version of, look, Azure, AWS, and GCP, those are the ones that we are using. These big companies, they have figured out, it's taken a while, but they've actually figured out with all these big Fortune 500 companies, how to work through the procurement process. So when we show up, we don't have to kind of figure that out from scratch. So we can leverage that. And then if you also have kind of maybe a pay-as-you-go type model, then the deal can get closed much faster, and it's not as scary and doesn't go through as much scrutiny. So you get in quick, prove the value, and grow over time. And that's what we're starting to see.
Yeah, cool. I actually think like that contract with consumption, which is, the way that would get described in marketplace terms, is a powerful business model. We see a lot of sellers take advantage of that because it's, you compare it to a free trial in SaaS consumes resources, and, a lot of people are willing to pay. Like they know what they want. They don't want some hacked version of your product. They're willing to commit to a contract that they'll only pay for what they use. And like, that is a flexible business model to get started. Hopefully that answered some of the pay-go question as we go. So I think like just restating clouds where it's at, budgets consolidating, using the cloud relationships and contracts are pretty powerful. Private offers are a mechanism, but there is flexibility to start quickly using some alternative business models. Heard a benefit around collections, like just guarantee around collections, maybe the timeline for collections could be a little more unpredictable, but knowing you're going to get it's really, really valuable. So just restating some of those benefits. All right, so maybe Dave, like from a sales professional standpoint, like what are people missing? I think we're like, I'll always joke, we're in the third inning of cloud. We're in like the first out of the first inning of marketplace, and digital selling is a new skill set, marketplace a new skill set. Like when you talk to sales teams and sales orders, like what do you think they're missing, and what should they be doing in regards to this movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the greatest salespeople out there remember to ask a lot of questions. And I think with Marketplace, it is another series of set of questions you need to ask in your first call, just to find out who their Marketplace provider, do they have a contract, all that other kind of easy qualifying things. And then as you progress through the sales process and you're embracing some kind of value orientation to your deal, one of that element could be, as you're doing the value prompter work, that you're including the proposal through the Marketplace and understanding the value to the customer through acquisition in that manner. I think it's asking questions and continuing to qualify and doing the work that you need to do as a rep, but oftentimes somehow forget to do. By the way, I'll just make a call. There's a guy on the call that worked for me like 20 years ago who is one of the best reps out there, John Farsich. And I'm like, I wonder if John's like remembering how to do this stuff, or if I have to like take him back to school and get him through the basics.
You could chat and comment. We could all find out. Like
I'm wondering if he's any good still. He was really good back then.
Nice. Okay, so we just had another question come in. So how would you frame the argument in favor of leveraging cloud budget when accounting may feel it muddles the point of budgeting and lets team eat into the bigger bucket of IT budget? And I think like a few different dimensions to that. One, you could say, does the cloud budget become like shadow IT? Or like, how do you think about the cloud budget when there's these subcomponents that may be more departmentally distributed or org?
Don't get me wrong, John. You still got to go through an approval process, right? You can't just in most companies, especially in this economic climate, the days of just spending money willy-nilly without getting somebody else to look at it, you're going to still need to justify this spend. But I think the question comes from Paul, is like, hey, Paul, you're not really mixing the budget per se as much as leveraging the vehicles that exist. And that you still have to go through the approval signature process inside a company. It's just one of the things that could help you speed up a deal. And maybe the CFOs have a different view than I do, but that's how I would view it if somebody came to me to get something through this kind of contract vehicle.
Yeah, I agree. I think, when the clouds first came out and we're starting with this, like the cloud, the committed spend, I think there was some confusion, and maybe there still is some when it's early, where all of a sudden there was this, oh my God, there's this budget out there, and all we have to do is attach to it, and it's kind of this free for all, right? I think that has matured over time, and I totally agree with what you just said of, like, ultimately, it's not going to be that CFOs and finance and companies don't realize that there's this big budget pie out there. It's really going to be, no, of course, you need to justify what you're spending and buying, and you'll still go through a similar vetting process, but it makes it easier in a lot of ways. It removes friction in a lot of ways. It provides additional discount, kind of like the credit card analogy, in a lot of ways. And it's the future in a lot of ways. And people and companies are heading in that direction. So to me, it makes sense to take advantage of this as much as you can. And why would you go against this or not take advantage when it's something that gives you that extra edge?
And for me, I mean, companies will handle this in a bunch of different ways. The way that we handle it is really, when spend comes in from a different department that wants to utilize the cloud budget, we don't, we don't suddenly say, hey, this doesn't hit your departmental budget anymore. It only hits the IT budget. We actually do push that dollar value back out to that actual department. But, when it gets to, to me and I need to approve it overall, it's significantly easier to get through me knowing that it goes through our cloud budgets because there's going to be financial benefits overall. And so we can look at it more holistically and actually you typically will get through approvals significantly faster by going and utilizing that alternative budget. So that's just how we do it here, but there can be many ways that it can be handled.
Yeah. And I do think from a velocity standpoint, for those who maybe are less familiar with transacting through marketplace, if you can embrace things like standard contracts from the clouds where you opt into the terms as well as the buyer opts into the terms, you can go from nothing to contracted in minutes to hours. Like, think about establishing a new relationship with a new buyer, especially a larger buyer. And Mike kind of glanced over this benefit of being able to do that where you're riding on the coattails of the cloud provider. It's just a very different process. And people often, when Tackle was growing, we built this company. There was no budget line item for a cloud marketplace platform. Like, that didn't exist. And we were able to leverage marketplace to tap into budget the same way that we're describing today. So I think that use of contract, use of budget, making this a tool in your arsenal as a seller, like, everyone's looking for more pathways to win. And like, the best sellers know that there's no one road. Like, if you're thinking about your options available to you and finding the path that makes the most sense, these are some of the good reasons. All right, so we're at about, thanks, Paul, and great to see you on the webinar, by the way. And we're at about 10 minutes to go. So maybe we'll just do a quick around the horn on any final thoughts people want to share, as well as a chance for people to ask final questions. So Ben, or Dave's ready to roll.
I was going to join in here really fast, John, because I think one of the questions that I often get is like, how do I get my salespeople to actually lever this, right? And how do I make sure they know it exists? And if I don't know who's on this call per se, but let's say you're a channel alliances person and you were tasked with an MBO earlier this year. It said, you need to get us on the GCP marketplace. Well, that's fine. That's a goal. But my guess is the person who assigned you that goal said, we need to get on because we want to unlock this much revenue. And so anytime you take on an initiative like this, you really have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of the initiative? I'm going to be responsible for doing it. And then how do I create enablement for my sellers, my go-to-market team, my finance team internally to make sure they're levering this appropriately? A marketplace by itself is not a panacea to all problems. Your product still has to solve critical issues. What you want, though, is to train your salespeople to think marketplace is a viable option for me to communicate custom or standard offers to my customers and help reduce friction. And I am seeing, people when we're recruiting people into my portfolio companies, if you've been effective selling through a marketplace, that's one of the gold stars that I put up there when I'm evaluating CROs or VPs of sales or even regional managers if I somehow get into those conversations. So I do think about this as you're recruiting people, as you're starting a project. How are you going to enable the sellers to be comfortable with it? You can't just sign up and then expect everything to work. You got to go do the work yourself to go make it happen.
Yeah, that's a great. I actually was talking to a CRO a couple of weeks ago, and they said they prioritize cloud go-to-market skills over domain expertise because they have so many people who understand their domain. They don't have a lot of people who know how to sell in this era of ecosystem and cloud go-to-market. So they were specifically targeting those skills.
Yep.
So we did get one question. Oh, yes.
So go ahead.
So we got one question. I'm not sure, this one might be hard to answer, but should larger companies like CrowdStrike and ServiceNow phase out their data centers and get on the cloud? How would a CFO react to such a transition from a P&L?
I mean, I could tell you the perspective at ServiceNow. If we were starting all over again as a $0 startup in 2003, we may not have, or whatever it was, 2007, we may not have started with our own data centers. In fact, we didn't start with our own data centers, but the cloud providers didn't really exist. We built our own or used space in a digital realty trust, all those kind of things, because we needed control before AWS and GCP existed. And then as we built that, we were purpose built for ourselves. That being said, over time, they've introduced different workloads going to different places because it made sense. And I don't want to get into the confidentiality of ServiceNow's data center strategy. I would say you always want to look at what's the right thing for your business and keep evaluating how that's going to tweak over time, whether it's a CFO thing or just a business thing. You know, margin's important, control of the quality of experience is important. And then the final thing is the strategic nature of the relationship you have with one of those providers. And, you know, again, in my past, we wanted great relationships with all the major players. We use their technology, they use some of ours. You know, it was very helpful. And that was an increasingly important reason on how we are making choices.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I think there's a fascinating, when you look at companies that were founded in certain eras of technology and the cost of running the company, like we're in this transition with serverless, especially, that the economics of building a new company in this latest era of cloud is insanely efficient. Like, and there's no doubt consumption grows and grows significantly. Data has weight and gravity. There are all these things that will cause you to drive massive consumption over time. But your ability to start small and be efficient, and you don't have to think about that as like, hey, do I get rid of my data center or not? But your competitors are being born with that efficiency. So that's it's a different angle for the competition to think about. So we had another question. Stated to be a bit tactical. I don't think it's that tactical, but what are the first steps one takes when looking to consolidate vendors? What kind of challenges are there when trying to gain visibility into what is critical, what's nice to have, spend? Does this data typically live in one centralized repository? And thanks for thinking our webinar was helpful. So I think that's a CFO question.
I can start. So it's hard when you get to a certain stage where you might have proliferation of technology in your company and you're trying to figure out how do you get down to a finite number of vendors? How do you reduce duplication of vendors, et cetera, right? And it's been a process that we've been going through within Tackle for the last several months as well. And I'd say I'll start with the challenges first, because that's easier to answer, right? The challenges of this, first and foremost, are that you might have users of different technologies that care very passionately about using a vendor. And so you might have 4 or 5 or 6 vendors that do the same thing, but you have 4 or 5 or 6 different departments using them, and they don't want to give it up because it's going to be disruptive to them in the short term to get onto an overall enterprise-wide license for a single technology. And so I'd say that the most of our time has been actually spent with stakeholders today, understanding their use cases, understanding their concerns about moving to a different technology, and making sure that as we transition people, that there's the least amount of disruption possible. And I would just say, from actually how you do that standpoint, I've seen it start with the procurement function. If you've got a procurement function, it can start with FP&A as well, if FP&A is able to get a good beat, or it can start with IT. I've seen it in different companies start in any of those 3 spots, and just starting with get a list of all your technologies, a list of what they do, and then understanding what the usage of each of those is, and tracking that in whatever mechanism. Sometimes you have a vendor management system, sometimes you don't. So a little bit of a tactical answer, but there you go.
So we did have a question in chat. I posted a resource to this cloud marketplace maturity guide by stage, which I think is a great resource done by our content team. But if you're a startup and you're thinking about marketplacing, think about where you're built, think about where your buyers' wallets are. And like, we see more companies being born marketplace native today, where they're defaulting their selling motion to use this infrastructure. So I think it's about focus, like keep it really simple, think about private offers. And then also like the majority of the buyers, like back to where the wallet is, like when you understand that, you can start, the simplest way to start for a startup is just start asking your buyers, would it be easier to buy from us on your cloud bill? Like, do you have a strategic relationship with a cloud provider? I think those questions you can start before you ever think about marketplacing. And then, Tackle's always here to help people accelerate this journey and make it a business decision versus a product and engineering decision.
Yeah, and I would say, like, if a company is just starting out and you want to go cloud first and marketplace first, that's one way to do it. And you set that up from the beginning. For a lot of companies that have sold without the marketplace for years, and now you want to introduce the marketplace, like at the company I'm at, now there's a transition. And what we found we needed to do was to reduce friction with some of our sales teams. And so what we ended up doing was saying, we are going to make it quota credit neutral. So there's the marketplace takes a little fee. But we said, we don't want our salespeople worrying about that because we want to encourage a lot of the business through the marketplace for all the reasons that we talked about. And so we ended up saying, we're going to remove that friction. And then also there's no substitute for just having a few folks who really believe in it and close some really good high profile deals. And so, for example, we have a win report that goes out. And every time a win report goes out with a marketplace deal, and they talk about how they close it faster, and it was aligned with our partners, that really gets the word out and starts moving things over with that momentum. So we took a few of those steps while we're in this transitionary period.
That's such a great, I think this Tiger team approach, get a small group of people who care about selling in a new way or inspired about this to go win some deals and let revenue be the tailwind in your sale as you build your cloud go to market. So sometimes people try to educate everyone in their company, and there is a point for that when you're at scale, but you want the social proof of why when you're going out to do that, because you can almost broadly educate too soon. All right, we are at top of the hour. I want to say thank you, David, Mike, Ben, for joining us today. Thank you everyone who participated, asked questions. We have a webinar. If this is helpful, we have another webinar on September 8th talking about Google, and we are always here to support you on your cloud go-to-market journey. Have a fantastic day. We'll talk to y'all soon. Thank you.